Different, Chapter 3. We were flying at tree level on Vector 030 out of Mistassini in northern Quebec. There were 4 of us, me, Kat, an elegant Frenchwoman, and a guy who looked like Bigfoot. Our destination was René Levasseur Island, and perhaps destiny. It was a 2-day trip from Knoxville to Montreal, and then from Montreal to Mistassini. The journey to Montreal was approximately 600 miles. If I had been operating at 10,000 feet, I could have flown my kite 650 miles. So we arrived in the afternoon. There we were much closer to the front lines, and I wanted to have fresh thoughts when we got to Mistassini. So we stayed overnight at the Hotel Laurentian in the center of town. After refueling, we drove the 500 miles to Mistassini in another 3.5 hours. Mistassini is part of the lands of the Cree tribe. In the summer, it hosts some of the best fishing in the world, but we were aiming for something more ambitious than trout. So we stopped in this town for a couple days, while everyone checked and rechecked their gear, and I made modifications to the Cherokee. Mistassini is on one of the largest lakes in the Canadian North, so we retrofitted my airplane to mount a pair of bushplane floats on it. The floats reduced airspeed and burned more gasoline, but they were necessary to land at Lac Coq, the target of the René Levasseur Island flight. René Levasseur and the Nazi lab would be an hour and a half away, but all that time would have to fly at an altitude of less than 300 feet to merge with the ground. Besides, it was the hour before total darkness, so getting there without crashing into something would be difficult. Calling René Levasseur an island is a bit of a misnomer. It was actually formed by a meteorite that hit Earth 214 million years ago. The impact created a crater about 60 miles in diameter. That's why the lake surrounding the island is almost perfectly round. René Levasseur itself is the second largest lake island in the world. It lies at the center of an impact crater, separated from the mainland by a narrow strip of water. That's why it's huge. Lac Coq is in the northwest corner, about 10 hours away. It is one of several normal-sized lakes that dot the surface of the large island. The Nazi bomb factory was on an even smaller island in the center of Lac Coq. As planned, night fell as we came in from the southwest. This scheme could only work if the Nazis were unaware of our presence. A large number of SS men were stationed on the shore of the lake, but no one was guarding the island where the facility was located. Why would they? It was in the middle of a small island in the middle of a big island in the middle of the desert. It was a tough flight. Radar is in direct line of sight, and we had to keep within sight of the big Nazi installation at Port Cartier. Nevertheless, we had a good chance of getting into the bomb shelter if I could manage to land so that no one would notice our arrival. The idea was to land on the lakeshore opposite the Wehrmacht camp and paddle the rest of the way, using a small island for cover. After I explained what was on my mind, Kat reluctantly agreed to introduce me to her friends. But in doing so, she warned me not to tell them who I was. She told me to just play along because guest from another dimension is not a very believable backstory. 2 of her friends were in the yard of a neighboring house tending a small garden. The woman, whose name was Bernadette, was wearing a frilly dress with a fancy little apron that looked expensive. The man was stripped to the waist and was sweating, digging at the places the woman pointed out. His name was King, like Kong, which was appropriate. He was short, stocky, with huge muscles in his shoulders and arms. Because he was so broad, he might have seemed overweight. But when I took off his shirt, I saw that this was an illusion. King was built like a tank. He didn't have an ounce of fat on him. I thought he was a brainless gorilla until he looked at me, and I saw the shrewd intelligence behind his eyes. He was a very formidable man. Bernadette was an exquisite Frenchwoman with laughing eyes and a will of steel. Kat had already told me that this lady was the Marquise Bernadette Larc de Languedoc. There must have been a whole story about how they got together. At first glance, they were the most mismatched couple imaginable. But underneath, they were exactly the same. Strong, brave, loyal, and clearly adoring each other. There was no better pair of companions to accompany them on their perilous journey. Bernadette was trained by the British Special Forces to blow things up. She wasn't just a plastic explosives artist, she was Van Gogh himself. Of course, all the supposed explosions would happen after we left, because the Nazis had stationed a whole brigade of SS men just a couple hundred yards away on the far bank, and we'd be like chickens in a fox house if they discovered we were there. King first got rid of the roving guards. He had 250 pounds of silent killer in him, was as agile as a cat, and unusually strong. Right now, however, the two of them resembled Fred and Wilma, digging their little vegetable garden. They were both slightly wary at our approach. Bernadette smiled kindly at Kat and asked, "Bonjour, Catherine. Who is your friend?" Kat said, "That's Eric. He was sent here to change the plan." She didn't mention that he was from another dimension. Both King and Bernadette looked even more wary. No one likes last-minute changes, especially when they're made by complete strangers. I knew I had to act quickly and convincingly, so I said as disarmingly as possible, "I know last-minute changes are bad craft, but this will increase our chances of survival and push the mission timeline back a few weeks." Now, they both looked interested. I said, "The disadvantage of the old plan was always the trek to and from the site. It would take you a long time, and it's hard. That's why I've been hired to take you directly to the target in a special airplane that can get you there undetected." I wasn't exaggerating. By World War II standards, the Cherokee was a technological marvel. I added, "You'll be able to accomplish your mission and get out of there before anyone can react." King said, "And how are you going to do it? The Nazis have air superiority everywhere." I was hoping that's what he was going to ask. I said, "We're going to fly around the range of their fighters and come in through the back door. The Me-262 is excellent, but its maximum range is 300 miles, closer to 200 if you include patrols." I failed to mention that I got all of this from Wikipedia. That might confuse things a bit. Now they looked very interested. I made my closing argument. "So, we'll fly into Montreal and then completely bypass their bases on the St. Lawrence, flying far north and then up to Rennes-le-Vasseur. We'll stay at tree height to hide from their radar. When we blow up the facility, we will return the same way. It's guarded by SS Panzer Grenadiers. They won't be able to pursue us." King looked at Bernadette, and she nodded. It was clear that this small, fragile woman was a modern-day Joan of Arc, and that their partnership was going to be real. King stood up, held out his hand to me, which was the size of a shovel, and said, "It's a deal, buddy." This started a beautiful friendship. The weather turned perfect, which suited my mood just fine. Okay, I may die next week, but it will be with the woman I loved. It was very exciting. All day, Kat and I worked on the itinerary and timing details, and then we made love all night. We even ran into Todd in Jackson Square. The joy of watching Kat and her ex-lover try their best to act casual almost made up for the grief their little tete-a-tete had caused me. I especially liked the radiant grin Todd bestowed on Kat when he said hello to her. My wife, as she left, muttered, "Dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum." Kat didn't know I knew about their little escapade, and of course Todd couldn't believe I was with her. So I told him on the side how often and passionately we spent time together. I could see that jealousy was killing him. Okay, I'll admit it. I liked twisting the knife. Since we had deviated from the script, we arrived at the Knoxville airport separately, to avoid uncomfortable questions about canceling the original plan. Kat, King, Bernadette, and all their gear traveled down in an army double. I rode the Scout, and then gave it to the private who had originally warned me about it. Then, we loaded all the necessities, backpacks, and Bernadette's little pets into the Cherokee and set off to meet our destiny. To make it work, we had to land as quietly as possible, so I throttled up, with the flaps fully closed, almost on glide. I struggled to maintain course, as any error at stall speed would be fatal. It was completely dark, and landing on the water in a low plane is difficult. You have to do it by feel, because you can't see where you are trying to land. Before tonight, I had made exactly 3 practice landings with the pontoons, so I had my fingers crossed as the Cherokee searched for water. Fortunately, it was a large lake. A creaking sound was heard under the pontoons, so I took the wheel again and cut the power. For a few seconds we carried on the surface, and then slowed down and stopped. The game was really in full swing. Everyone in the cabin seemed to exhale. We went into our well-rehearsed routine. There is only one exit in the Cherokee, and that is across from where the pilot sits. Bernadette ended up next to that door, with King in the right rear seat to balance his weight. Bernadette jumped out and jumped onto the pontoon, nimble as a squirrel on a tree branch, and King unloaded. We had an inflatable raft in the cargo area behind the back seat. Bernadette opened the hatch, and King pulled out the big raft. He then unloaded the rest of the stuff, while Bernadette inflated the raft. Meanwhile, I secured the airplane with a simple mushroom anchor. The raft was almost full of the four of us and all our gear, but we were only 50 yards from shore. I would have called our near-perfect arrival great piloting. But I knew it was really just dumb luck. King and I pulled the raft onto the rocky scree while the women unloaded. The very brave people at Mosquito RCAF had taken detailed photographs of the site, and we had studied them all the previous 4 days, so we knew exactly what we were looking at. We found ourselves to the southeast of the bomb building, which was hidden in the trees about 30 yards away. There were no guards in sight, but that didn't mean there weren't any. King disappeared noiselessly into the woods, and for the next 15 minutes, we heard a series of small sounds like those of dying men. I counted 6, but there might have been more. King reappeared, tucking in his knife, and looking as impassive as a man who had just wandered into the woods to lie down. He said, "Everyone outside the building has been neutralized." I thought that was an interesting choice of words. The building itself was undoubtedly disturbed, and that's when Kat surprised me. She slipped past us and did something to a metal box with light bulbs and wires. We were all in tight black clothes with balaclavas on our heads. I couldn't resist gawking at her perfect round ass as my wife opened the access panel and exposed some wires. Kat fiddled around some more, then whispered, "The alarm is disabled." Apparently, she also unlocked the door, because King just opened it and walked in. He disappeared for a couple minutes. When he came back and whispered, "All clear." I didn't ask how many more bodies there were. The building looked like a small factory. There was equipment everywhere, and it was confusing. But Kat seemed to know exactly where to go. She headed resolutely toward an area with elevators and large carts, using a penlight to skirt around objects, one of which was a body with its neck at an incredibly odd angle. The objects my wife was walking toward looked like large aerial bombs. They were hanging from elevators, and there were strange cylindrical objects on carts underneath them. Kat was wearing a tool belt, and she started unscrewing the access panel on the first cylinder. Inside was a shiny metal sphere, which she removed with King's help and put into her backpack. She then moved on to the next cylinder and repeated the process. When she was done, she had 4 small balls in 2 separate packages. It was all done with the precision that has always been my wife's trademark. In the meantime, Bernadette was busy climbing on and under objects, applying a putty-like substance that I carried for her. I also had a spool of wire with me. She would pull a section out of it, which she would connect to something that looked like a pencil and insert into the putty. As she worked, the woman hummed "Sur le pont d'Avignon" softly. Bernadette was a great customer. The whole feat took no more than 15 minutes. Then King, who was carrying both backpacks as casually as if they were shopping bags, came over and handed one to me. It was so heavy that my knees nearly buckled. These little balls weren't bowling balls or cannonballs. They were much heavier. I asked, "What's here?" He said indifferently, as if we were just chatting. "Oh, these are U-235 fission triggers. Don't drop them." Oh my God. I was holding a bag full of nuclear holocaust, and he tells me not to drop them. We returned to the raft, loaded the division triggers into our backpacks, and King swam the oars. They were so heavy they almost sank the raft. Then he came back and picked up Kat and me. We prepared the Cherokee for takeoff, and King swam after Bernadette, who lingered on the shore holding another small metal box. I had time to warm up the engine before King and Bernadette climbed into the cab. As we taxied out, there were a few muffled thumps in the building, not loud enough to alarm the camp on the opposite bank. Then, as we picked up speed, I saw the whole place begin to collapse. I circled over the object and turned back, and there he lay in a pile of masonry and bent steel. The Nazis wouldn't be making bombs in that place for a long time. Even better, we had their existing fission triggers. On the way to Mistisini, we were gloomy. For one thing, I had to keep my concentration on the job, flying around trees and mountains. We were right on deck because the Luftwaffe could show up in full force as soon as they got the message. And my poor Cherokee wouldn't stand a chance against me 262. However, there was another factor. King, Bernadette, and Kat were convinced that they had volunteered for a suicide mission. Now they had their lives back. More importantly, Kat now had the husband she thought she had lost forever. As for me, my beloved wife was alive. I don't know if you can imagine how heartbreakingly satisfying that was. Just imagine the tears I cried sitting on that lonely bench in Michigan, and maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. Believe me, it was a feeling beyond earthly comprehension. Landing at Mistassini was as dangerous as at Lac Caux, because I still had nothing to guide me but moonlight. But it was a big lake, and I was so inspired by the thought of having my dear woman with me that I could land on the wings of love, carrying a Cherokee on my back. We parted ways at the Knoxville airport. The search for King and Bernadette didn't end until the last Nazi was killed, and Kat had to return to Oak Ridge to quit her job. Her life as a commando scientist was over forever. She was my wife, and I was her husband. Me and my trusty Cherokee? Well, we just disappeared into the fog, like we never existed. There'd be too many questions if I'd stayed. Who cares about fame when you've got everything you could ever want in life? Dear viewer, we have reached the epilogue. Let me remind you that the full version is on our Patreon. But in the meantime, I'll continue the narrative. I sat by the pool and watched Piper swim laps. She was almost 11, and her paddling was as smooth and powerful as someone who had long ago existed in another dimension. The realization that you have passed on a special part of yourself to one of our children gives you a pleasant sense of immortality. Speaking of love, my beloved Kat lay face down in a modest bikini that did nothing to hide her stunning ass. Her thick sheaf of wheat hair was bleached almost white by the sun, and the rest of her gorgeous body was covered in a rich golden tan. My wife has a feline ability to sense when someone is looking at her. She raised her head and smiled secretly at me. It was full of carnal promise. As the biblical dude said, my cup overflowed. The war ended almost 12 years ago. Our feat became a footnote in history, like the Telemark raid in my dimension. But it was decisive, because it allowed the US to win the nuclear arms race. Shortly after our return, Manhattan Project scientists perfected a warhead that could be delivered by an Atlas missile. The Atlas was America's version of a secret weapon. It was developed at Cape Canaveral, and the secrecy surrounding its development no doubt explains why my sudden appearance at the test site startled the military. The Atlas was capable of hitting a target thousands of miles away in just 20 minutes. Therefore, although the Nazis controlled the Atlantic and had air superiority on both continents, it was impossible to stop the delivery of instant Armageddon from the far reaches of the exosphere. The first nuclear warning was transmitted to all occupied territories in October 1962. Oddly enough, this coincided with the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis in my dimension. The deadline for unconditional surrender was set for the following week. Of course, the demand was ignored, leading to the blossoming of a fire mushroom on an uninhabited part of the Greenland ice cap. The physical demonstration should have convinced the Nazis that we intended to do business, but they stubbornly refused to even discuss surrender. As a result, the next blow was to their main logistical center in Iceland. Most of the population was concentrated in Reykjavik. As a result, there were few civilian casualties. But the Wehrmacht in Quebec quickly found that it had run out of food and ammunition. It was then that the US and Canada launched a swift left strike north of the Saguenay Line, led by M4 of Patton's Third Army. The old Blood and Guts successfully trapped two entire German armies in a cauldron between Baie-Comeau and Bradley's forces on the Saguenay. It was Stalingrad on steroids, and this major coup virtually ended the German presence in North America. And again, there was a call for unconditional surrender that was ignored by the leaders of the Third Reich. Their spies told them that we only had 2 bombs, so the Germans thought we had used them up. That's why the Nazis were so stunned when the quaint old city of Dresden disappeared in a nuclear blaze. The loss of life and destruction was horrifying, but fewer people actually died in that dimension than the 200,000 who died in the mine bombing of Dresden. It was then that the Nazis realized that the 4 triggers we had captured during our raid had made a difference. The call for unconditional surrender was sounded again, and the entire Nazi leadership went to Berlin to decide what to do. The decapitating blow to the Reichstag settled the matter. Hitler and his entire gang of homicidal maniacs were vaporized in a nanosecond. Paradoxically, there were fewer civilian casualties than during the last battles around Berlin in my dimension. After the grand finale, the Germans managed to scrape together Alfred Jodl and Albert Speer to sign the surrender documents. This took place in Bonn, which was to become the capital of the German Republic while Berlin was deactivated. It was estimated to take about 40 years. The surrender guaranteed that all the land seized by the Nazis would return to their former owners, and all their loot would be returned. Strangely enough, the German people themselves celebrated in the streets as if they too had been liberated. For them, life under the heavy hand of the Nazi Party was no different from that of the citizens of France or England. The threat of the 2 remaining bombs was enough to convince the Japanese that it would be a good idea to pack up and go home. The terms were simple. The Japanese promised that they would not retreat from their original territorial boundaries. In return, the 2 great cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would continue to prosper and do business. After the war, American society boomed, and the construction industry boomed as more and more Americans enjoyed the good life on Miami Beach. It was for this reason that I, as a very wealthy and relatively young man, sat on the pool deck of a mansion in Coral Gables. I didn't run the company anymore. I had people for that. Instead, I dedicated my life to making Kat and my 2 daughters happy. In 2 lifetimes, I've learned a few things. The first and most important is that without a family, you are nothing. That's a lesson I plan to never forget. My exceptional wife has managed to raise 2 children and make me happy while doing pioneering research in string theory and interdimensional interactions. Any woman can do that, if she's brilliant enough. The scientific community was utterly amazed that it was almost as if Kat had comprehended supersymmetry. It was as if she had observed the phenomenon herself. From time to time, Kat went on trips to visit the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. After all, a girl has to be involved in particle physics somehow, doesn't she? Of course, my 2 daughters and I would go with her. My wife would be doing pioneering experiments with bosons and fermions, and the kids and I would be skiing or traveling through the beautiful towns of Provence. All in all, just a normal family vacation. Piper, my oldest, was a natural-born athlete, just like I once was. She was Daddy's little girl and went everywhere with me. It was exactly the same strong bond I had with another little girl in another dimension. Sometimes I felt like Piper's sweet soul had traveled across dimensions with me. I don't think it's possible to love a child more than I loved my oldest daughter. On the other hand, Brooklyn, who was 8 years old, was a mirror image of her mom, petite and very beautiful. She was the idealist in the family, passionate about the environment. It was strange to see such a young child so attuned to the big picture, but my girl was born with an old soul that reflected the wisdom of life experience. Brookie was as patriotic as my wife Kat. Kat, of course, was a lack Coke hero, so she was always in demand at patriotic celebrations such as the 4th of July. Brooke walked around with her mother, dressed in an Air Force Class A uniform, just like Kat's. Only Kat had a pair of gold stars on her collar. Bernadette and King have become key figures in a small company in Langley, Virginia. King may look like Bigfoot in a custom-made suit, but he's one of the chief planners at the tip of the spear, in a world of subterfuge and deception. He seems comfortable there. His dainty little wife still likes to blow things up. King and Bernadette are nearing retirement, so they divide their time between their home in McLean and their hereditary chateau near Avignon. It is there that their extensive vineyards are located. These 2 have come a long way from the small garden they were planting when I first met them. The 4th member of this heroic group simply vanished into the mists of time as the Lone Ranger. His identity is still a mystery that historians are struggling to unravel. That was exactly what he wanted, for the greatest reward of all awaited him. I am here to tell you that I have come a long way from sobbing next to 2 graves in the dark and gloomy place where I was born. I became the husband of a very special man and the father of 2 wonderful young women. That is truly all a person can expect from life, or, as the case may be, life. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to my stories and this incredible journey through a story of courage, sacrifice, and triumph. A quick reminder that many scenes have been censored and cut, and the full version with it all is on our Patreon. As we navigate the twists and turns of this gripping narrative, our heroes face the daunting task of infiltrating the Nazi bomb factory on the island of René Levasseur. Our protagonist, Eric, uncovers a daring plan to change the course of history by enlisting the help of a formidable duo, King and Bernadette. These seemingly incompatible heroes are united by unstoppable strength, courage, and a love that defies conventional expectations. As the team faces the dangers of landing on Lac Coke, maneuvering in the dark, and executing their plan with surgical precision as they complete their mission. Kat, Marquise, and the mysterious Lone Ranger play crucial roles in the symphony of espionage and destruction. What struck me most about this story was the fusion of seemingly disparate elements: love and war, science and subterfuge. Eric, excited by the prospect of being reunited with his beloved Kat, organizes a daring feat that ultimately changes the course of history. The post-war aftermath, described in vivid detail, underscores the profound consequences of our heroes' actions. The Nazi surrender, the swift left strike, and the nuclear strikes on Dresden and Berlin, all orchestrated by captured fission triggers, turned the world order upside down. Transported to the present, Eric reflects on a life filled with love, family, and the pursuit of happiness. The sacrifices made during that dangerous mission laid the foundation for a future free from the tyranny of the Third Reich. In conclusion, this story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of love, and the ability of individuals to shape the course of history. Our heroes, faced with insurmountable odds, triumphed over darkness, leaving behind a legacy that echoes through time. Thank you for joining me on this adventure. Remember, the full uncensored version is available on our Patreon. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and always keep the bright flame of hope burning brightly.